Welcome to Sleepy Harbour. Let the light in the room go soft. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding themselves all day, a little higher than they needed to be, the way shoulders do. There is nothing you have to solve in the next few hours, nothing that needs deciding tonight. You can set it all down at the edge of the bed like a coat you have finally taken off, and we will pick none of it back up. Tonight we are going somewhere quiet and strange, and in its own way, deeply reassuring. We are going into the 2 in the morning of the mind. And by the time we are finished, you may never be quite so afraid of it again. You know the place I mean. You have been there. Everyone who has ever lain awake has been there. It is a specific hour, though it does not keep to the clock exactly. Sometimes it is 2, sometimes it is 3:30, or that long grey stretch before the birds start, when the house has gone completely still and the street outside has stopped making its small daytime sounds. You are awake, and there is a thought with you. Just one, usually a conversation that did not go the way you wanted, a bill, a thing you said 6 years ago, a person you love, and the small cough they had at dinner, a decision you are not sure of. And here, in the dark, that single thought does something it never does in daylight. It grows, it puts on weight, it reaches out and touches every other worry in the house and joins them all together into one enormous, seamless, immovable dread. And you lie there underneath it, certain, absolutely certain, that this is the true size of your life, and that you have simply been too distracted all day to see it. And then the morning comes. The kettle goes on, the light gets into the corners of the room. You move through the first ordinary tasks of the day, and somewhere around 10 o'clock, coffee gone slightly cold beside you. You remember the thing that had you pinned to the mattress at 2, and it has shrunk. Not vanished, necessarily, but shrunk. It is a normal-sized problem again. It has edges. It fits inside a single afternoon. And a small, tired part of you says, as it has said 100 times before, why do I do that to myself? Every single time. Here is the first thing I want you to hear tonight, and I want you to hear it slowly, because almost no one has ever said it to you plainly. That is not a flaw in your character. That is not weakness, and it is not you being dramatic, and it is not some hidden truth surfacing in the honest dark that the busy day keeps hidden from you. It is the opposite of all of that. What happens to a worry at 2 in the morning is a documented, measurable, physical event that happens inside a human brain under a particular set of conditions. It has been watched in a laboratory. It has been photographed. It has a mechanism, and the mechanism is the same in you as it is in the person 3 streets over and the person on the far side of the world. All of them lying awake right now under their own single enormous thought. You are not doing something wrong at 2 in the morning. Something is being done to you, gently and predictably and entirely, without your permission, by the machinery you were born with. And once you understand the machinery, the whole thing loses a great deal of its power. So before we go any further, let me plant the shape of it, the single idea that everything else tonight hangs from. Because it really does come down to one thing, and it is an asymmetry. 2 systems in the brain, and at 2 in the morning they are not in the same condition as each other. The first system is the one that generates threat. It is the part of you that notices danger, that flags what might go wrong, that lights up when something feels unsafe. You do not choose to run it. It runs on its own, underneath everything, all day and all night, and it is very, very old, older than language, older than reason, a piece of equipment that kept your distant ancestors alive by being alarmed slightly too easily rather than slightly too late. And here is the crucial thing about that system at 2 in the morning. It is fine. It is fully awake. If anything, it is turned up. The threat generator does not get tired the way the rest of you gets tired. It does not clock off at the end of a long day. It is, at 2 in the morning, entirely, robustly online. And the second system is the one that supplies proportion. Call it the brake. It is the part of you that takes a fear and puts it in context, that says, yes, but, and hold on, and is it really? And let's look at this properly. It is the part that weighs a thing against reality, that reappraises, that talks the alarm down off the ledge. It is the newer equipment, the reasoning, regulating, grown-up part of the brain, and it is the part that makes you able to feel a flash of fear and then decide calmly that the flash was bigger than the facts. That is its whole job, to supply proportion, to be the brake on the alarm. And that second system, the brake, does get tired. It gets tired across a long day the way a muscle gets tired. It is expensive to run, and it burns through its resources, and by the time you are lying in the dark at the far end of a full waking day, having made 1,000 small decisions and held yourself together through all of them, that system is running on fumes. It is depleted. It is, in a very real and measurable sense, offline or close to it. So look at the two of them together, because this is the whole video in a single picture. At 2 in the morning, the machine that manufactures fear is fully powered, and the machine that supplies proportion is running on empty. The accelerator is pressed to the floor, and the brake is not connected. That is the asymmetry. That is why the same worry feels bigger at night. Not because the worry got bigger. Because the thing inside you that was supposed to keep it small clocked off hours ago and left the alarm running all by itself with no one in the room to talk it down. Now, I told you there was a number, and there is, and I am going to hold on to it for just a little while longer, because I want you to have the whole picture before I hand you the figure that proves it. But let me tell you, it exists. There is a study. Scientists put people who had not slept next to people who had, and they watched inside their brains while they looked at upsetting things. And they measured exactly how much more the sleepless brain reacted, one night. And a number came out of that experiment that, once you have heard it, you will never quite be able to unhear, because it is so much larger than you would guess. One night, and a percentage. We will get to it. Hold it there in the back of your mind, a small lit window we will walk back to. One night. 60. Keep it. We will come for it. And while it settles, let me do the thing I always like to do here, near the beginning, when the room is quiet and we are just getting comfortable. I would like to know where you are. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever hour it happens to be where you are. Whatever the weather is doing outside your window, if you feel like it. Leave a word in the comments and tell me the place. It is one of my favourite things, reading them, this long scattered list of towns and cities and quiet rooms all over the world, all of them awake or half awake at the same time. All of them heading for the same harbour. And if you are new here, if this is your first night with us, you are very welcome, and if you would like more of these, slow and careful and calm, then subscribing is the way to keep the harbour lights on. That is all. No rush, we have hours yet. Let us go back down into the machinery. I want to give the two systems their proper names, because the names matter, and because knowing them changes how the whole thing feels. When you can name the part of you that is frightening you, it stops being a formless dread and becomes a piece of equipment doing its ordinary job, and equipment is far less frightening than a shapeless dark. The threat generator has a name. It is called the amygdala. It is small, and there are two of them, one on each side, buried deep and low in the brain, tucked in near the front of each temple, roughly behind your eyes and a little inward, an almond-shaped node of tissue on each side, which is in fact where the name comes from, the old word for almond. It is not where you do your thinking. It is much older and much deeper than that. The amygdala is a kind of sentry. Its work is fast and blunt, and it does not wait for the facts to be fully in. It flags. It sounds. It notices the shape in the corner of the visual field before the slow reasoning part of you has decided whether the shape is a coat on a chair or an intruder. And it sounds the alarm first and lets you sort out the details afterward. Because across the long history of staying alive, the creature that reacted to the coat as though it might be an intruder simply outlived the creature that waited politely to be sure. The amygdala is the reason you flinch. It is the reason your stomach drops before you have consciously understood the email. It is the smoke detector, and like a smoke detector, it is designed to be a little too sensitive on purpose, because the cost of one false alarm is a jump and a wasted minute, and the cost of one missed real alarm could be everything. So it errs. It always errs toward alarm. That is not a defect. That is the design. And here is what you need to know about the amygdala at 2 in the morning. It does not run down. It is not the part that gets tired. If anything, the conditions of the night wind it tighter. So all through the small hours, while the rest of you is exhausted, the sentry is at its post, wide awake, calling out every shape in the dark, and calling them all a little more loudly than it would in the daylight. The other system, the brake, also has a name, and it sits at the very front of the brain, right up behind your forehead, in a region called the prefrontal cortex. This is the newest part of the human brain, evolutionarily speaking, the part that swelled and elaborated most in becoming us, and it is where the grown-up work happens, the planning, the weighing, the deciding, the holding of yourself steady when a feeling wants to sweep you off. And there is a particular strip of it, along the middle, the part folded in toward the center, called the medial prefrontal cortex, that has a very specific, and for our purposes tonight, absolutely central role. It is the part that reaches down to the amygdala and regulates it. It is the hand on the sentry's shoulder. It is the calm senior voice that hears the alarm go off and comes over to look and says, "All right, I see it, it's a coat, stand down." It supplies the proportion. When the amygdala flares, it is the medial prefrontal cortex that takes that flare and measures it against everything you know about the actual world, and either agrees that yes, this is a real danger, act, or, far more often, judges that the alarm has overshot the facts and gently turns the volume down. This is the machinery of reappraisal. This is the part of you that can take a frightening thought and re-see it, reweigh it, put it back at its true size. And this is the part that gets tired. The prefrontal cortex is, in the plainest physical terms, expensive. It costs a great deal to run. It burns through its fuel at a rate the older, deeper structures do not, and because it is expensive, it is fragile in a particular way. When resources get scarce, it is among the very first regions to show the strain. Push a person through a long day, or a short night, or both, and the prefrontal cortex is the first light to dim. The deep old sentry keeps firing at full strength. the refined new regulator fades early. So the brake is not just a little weaker at the end of a long day. The brake is, specifically and reliably, the first thing to go. I want you to sit with how neat and how cruel that arrangement is, because it explains the entire experience. The two systems do not tire at the same rate. The one that raises alarms is durable and stays lit. The one that calms them is delicate and fades first. And so, as the hours of wakefulness stack up, as the day gets longer and the night gets later, the two of them drift further and further out of balance until you reach the small hours in a state where the alarm is at full strength and the calm is nearly gone. Same brain, same person, same actual problems in the actual world, no bigger and no smaller than they were at lunchtime. But the internal balance between fear and proportion has tipped almost all the way over to one side. And you feel that tip from the inside, not as a change in your brain chemistry, which is what it actually is, but as a change in the truth of your life. You feel it as, everything is worse than I thought. When what has actually happened is far simpler and far kinder. Not everything got worse. Your brake got tired. And now we can go and collect that number, because you have the picture it belongs to. Some years ago, a team of researchers led by a scientist named Seung-Shik Yu, working with the sleep researcher Matthew Walker, ran an experiment and published it in the journal Current Biology in 2007. They took a group of healthy people and they divided them. One group was allowed a normal night of sleep. The other group was kept awake, a single night, no sleep at all. Just one. And then they slid each person, rested and unrested alike, into a brain scanner, a machine that can watch which parts of the brain light up and work harder from moment to moment, and they showed all of them a series of images, some neutral, some upsetting, the kind of pictures designed to prod at the emotional brain. And while the people looked, the machine watched the amygdala, the sentry, to see how hard it fired. In the rested people, the amygdala did what a healthy amygdala does. It reacted to the upsetting images, sensibly, in proportion, a normal flare and then a settling. But in the people who had lost a single night of sleep, the amygdala did not react in proportion. It reacted enormously, on the order of 60%, more strongly than in the rested group. 60%. Not 6, 60. The same photographs, shown to the same kind of person, and one lost night of sleep had turned up the volume on the brain's threat generator by more than half. Let that number stand in the room for a moment, because a photograph is a fixed thing. The image on the screen did not change. It was exactly as upsetting or exactly as neutral for the rested person as for the tired one. Nothing about the outside world moved. And yet the internal reaction to that unchanged world was more than half again as large in the brain that had gone without sleep. That is your 2 in the morning, measured. That is the amygdala, wound tight by tiredness, treating the ordinary furniture of your life as 60% more threatening than it actually is. The email is the same email. The cough at dinner was the same small cough. The conversation happened exactly as it happened, but the machine that measures how much to fear them has had its dial turned up, and you are reading its inflated output as the honest size of things. And here is the second half of what that same study found, and it is the part I most want you to carry away tonight, because it is the mechanism underneath the mechanism. When those researchers looked not just at how hard the amygdala fired, but at how well it was connected to the medial prefrontal cortex, the brake, the regulator, They found that the connection had weakened. The two regions, which in a rested brain are in close and constant conversation, the sentry calling and the senior voice answering, had grown quiet with each other. The lines between them had gone slack. The scientists described it, in the language of the field, as a decoupling, a reduced functional connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, which is a careful, technical way of saying something very simple and very human. The alarm was blaring, and the hand that normally reaches over to calm it was no longer in touch with it. The brake was not merely weak. The cable between the brake and the wheel had gone loose. Sit with that, because it is extraordinary that we can even say it. This is not a metaphor I have invented to make you feel better. This is a thing that was watched directly inside living human brains in a scanner and written down in a scientific journal for anyone to check. The accelerator intact and roaring, the brake not just tired but disconnected from the very thing it is supposed to slow. That is not a mood. That is not you being fragile. That is a photograph of the exact machinery that runs your 2 in the morning, and it is the same photograph for everyone. So when you lie there in the dark and the single thought grows and grows until it fills the whole house, what is actually happening is not a revelation, it is a decoupling. Your sentry is firing at 60% above true, and the wise voice that would normally lean over and say, "Gently, it's a coat, stand down," has lost the line. The alarm is going off in an empty control room, and you, lying there, are hearing the alarm and mistaking it for the news. Now I want to plant one more thing before we rest here for a moment and let all of this settle, and it is the idea that everything in the rest of our night is going to circle slowly back to, so I want to lay it down carefully now, like setting a stone at the bottom of the harbour where you will find it again later. If the daytime brain, with its brake fully connected and its proportion machinery fully fueled, sees a problem at one size, and the 2 in the morning brain, with its brake disconnected and its alarm turned up, sees that same problem at another, larger size, then a very natural question arises, and almost no one has ever thought to ask it out loud. Which of those 2 brains is telling you the truth? Because we tend to assume, without ever examining the assumption, that the 2 in the morning version is the honest one. There is an old, seductive idea wound deep into how we talk about the night, that the small hours strip away our defences and show us how things really are. That the day is where we hide from ourselves with busyness and distraction. And the dark is where the truth we have been avoiding finally catches up with us. It feels true at 2 in the morning that you are seeing clearly at last, that the terror is clarity, that this, finally, is the real size of your life, and every calm daytime hour was a comfortable lie. But look at what we have just learned about the machinery and ask it again. At 2 in the morning, the part of your brain that supplies proportion is depleted and disconnected. The part that reappraises, that reweighs, that measures a fear against the full picture of reality is running on fumes and has lost its line to the alarm. So the 2 in the morning version of a problem is not the version produced by clear seeing. It is precisely the version produced with the clear seeing equipment switched off. It is the reading you get when the one instrument whose entire job is to supply proportion has gone offline. That is not clarity. That is the opposite of clarity. That is the alarm with no one left to check it. And the daytime version, the one you always dismiss as denial, as you simply being too busy to feel the real weight of things, is in fact the version produced with all the equipment back online, the brake reconnected, the proportion machinery refueled by sleep, the sentry and the senior voice, back in conversation. The daytime reading is the calibrated one. The 2 in the morning reading is the miscalibrated one. It is not that the day hides the truth from you. It is that the night takes away the very tool you need in order to see the truth at all. And here is the loop I am going to leave open, hanging in the dark, for us to come back to much later tonight. Because it is, I think, the most quietly powerful thing in the whole of this. You already have the proof. You, personally, you have been running this experiment on yourself your entire adult life without ever once writing down the result. Think, just for a moment, and gently, of all the nights. All the 2 in the mornings when a thing was so certainly catastrophic that you could not sleep. And then think of the mornings that followed them. How many of those catastrophes, seen again in daylight, turned out to be exactly as enormous as they had felt at 2? How many of those absolute, unsurvivable, end-of-everything 2 in the morning problems were still at 10 o'clock, absolute and unsurvivable, and the end of everything? Take your time with the question. But I suspect you already know the shape of the answer, because it is the same shape for almost everyone who has ever lain awake. The night version has essentially never once turned out to be the accurate one. Not once. The problems were real, some of them. Life has real problems in it. But the size they wore at 2 in the morning, the crushing, total, no-way-through size, that size has never survived contact with the morning. It always deflates. Every single time. You have a lifetime of evidence for this. A ledger going back years, decades, thick with entries, every one of them saying the same thing. The night reading was too big, the day reading was true. And you have never been invited to add it up. No one ever sat you down and said, look at your own record, look at the actual outcomes, and notice that the 2 in the morning voice has a perfect, unbroken track record of being wrong about the size of things. We are going to come back to that. It is the heart of the whole night, and I want to earn it slowly, because there is a great deal still to lay in place first. We have named the asymmetry, and we have collected the number 60%, and we have seen the decoupling, the brake gone loose from the wheel. But tiredness, it turns out, is only the first of the reasons, and not even, in some ways, the strangest. Because you might reasonably think, well, then it is just about being tired, and if I could only get to sleep, the problem would solve itself. And that is true, as far as it goes. But it does not go all the way. There is something else at work in the small hours, something that is not about how many hours you have been awake at all, but about what time it is. About the clock itself and what the clock does to a human being, independently of tiredness, as a matter of deep biological timing. There is a name for the hours in which it does this, a name researchers have actually given to that stretch of the night. And there is a whole physiological low tide that your body drops into in the dead center of the dark that has nothing to do with how busy your day was. We are going to go down into that next, but not yet. For now, just hold what we have. The sentry that never tires, the brake that fades first, the 60%, the loose cable between the 2. And the quiet, steadying fact underneath all of it, the one to breathe slowly around as the room gets darker and your body gets heavier into the bed. Whatever the thought is tonight, whatever it is that has decided to grow, the version of it that is with you now, in the dark, is not the true one. It is the reading from an instrument that is missing the one part it needs to read correctly. It has always been too big, and in the morning, as it has in every morning that ever followed a night like this, it will come back down to its real and manageable size, and you will wonder, a little, why it ever seemed otherwise. You do not have to believe that yet. You only have to hold it, lightly, the way you would hold something small and warm in a cold room, while we go on together. Slower still, into the deeper reason the night does what it does. And so let us go there now. Let us go to the number. Because there is a number. And it is not a soft number, not an estimate dressed up in clinical language to sound more certain than it is. It is a figure that came out of a neuroimaging laboratory, a controlled experiment with real participants and real scanners, and a before and an after, and it sits in the published record in a journal called Current Biology. And it has not gone away in the years since it was put there. The researchers were Sung-Shik Yo and his colleagues, working with Matthew Walker at the time, and the year was 2007, and what they did was straightforward in design, even if the findings were not. They took people. They kept some of them from sleeping for a full night. They let others sleep normally. And then they put both groups into brain scanners and showed them images, negative images, images with an emotional charge, images that the brain registers as things to be concerned about. And they measured what the amygdala did in response. In the people who had slept, it responded. It did what it is supposed to do. It flagged the images as significant, and it produced an appropriate reaction, and then, importantly, it was reined in. The system worked the way the system is designed to work. But in the people who had gone without sleep, the amygdala did something different. It did not simply respond. It surged, roughly 60% more reactive to those negative images than the well-rested group. 60%. Not slightly elevated, not modestly increased. 60% greater amplitude in the threat response to the same images in the same scanner under the same conditions, with the only variable being 1 night of sleep. That number deserves a moment. 60% is not a rounding error. If you imagine 2 otherwise identical people sitting in the same room, looking at the same photograph of something troubling, the one who has not slept will have an amygdala firing with roughly 60% more force than the one who has. The same image, the same pair of eyes, wildly different internal readings, and this is not a study that has been quietly retracted or superseded or qualified into meaninglessness. It has been built upon, extended, refined, and it sits at the center of a body of work that has accumulated in the years since. 60%. Hold that number the way you would hold a stone you have just picked up and found much heavier than you expected. Because that weight is the beginning of understanding what happened to you, specifically. The last time a thought grew enormous somewhere around 2 in the morning. But the number alone is not yet the full story. The number tells you the amygdala was louder. What it does not immediately tell you is why being louder matters so much more at night than it would during the day, and to understand that you need to look at what you and Walker and their colleagues found when they looked at the other end of the conversation. Because the amygdala does not operate in a vacuum. It is not an isolated alarm sitting in the basement of the skull, ringing whenever it chooses with no one in a position to respond. Under normal, rested circumstances, it is in constant communication with a region of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex, which sits at the very front of the brain, just behind the forehead, and this region is, in the simplest terms available, the voice of proportion. It is the part of the brain that receives the alarm signal and does the work of contextualizing it. That puts the thing in perspective. That reminds the system that the email you got from your manager, though uncomfortable, is not actually a threat to your survival. That takes the raw, urgent signal from the amygdala and runs it through a layer of evaluation that produces something more measured than panic. The medial prefrontal cortex is not the alarm. It is the person standing next to the alarm who knows how to tell the difference between a fire and burnt toast, and who has the authority to say, calmly, which one this is. And in the sleep-deprived brain, what the neuroimaging showed was this: the functional connection between the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex was reduced, not gone entirely, but weakened. The cable, to borrow the image from earlier, had come loose. The amygdala was firing with 60% greater force, and the region designed to evaluate and moderate that signal was receiving it with reduced fidelity, returning reduced regulatory influence in kind. The accelerator was pressing harder than usual, the brake was working at diminished capacity. And both of those things were happening simultaneously in the same brain, in response to the same input, because of the absence of one night of sleep. This is the asymmetry. This is the one that matters. Not simply that the brain becomes more emotional when tired, which is the version of the story that circulates in popular understanding and is true as far as it goes, but does not go nearly far enough. The more precise version is that the two systems that together produce your assessment of how serious something is become decoupled from each other in a very specific and very asymmetric way. The system that generates the sense of threat keeps going. It does not tire out. If anything, as the data shows, it activates more strongly. And the system that is supposed to sit next to that signal and translate it into something proportionate and contextualized and livable quietly loses its grip. So you do not simply feel more. You feel more, and the internal mechanism that would normally reach in and say yes, but here is the actual scale of this. Here is the real weight of it. Here is what it will look like from 100 yards away and in better light. That mechanism is precisely the one that has gone quiet. The threat is louder, the proportion is softer. And in the silence between them, the 2am thought expands into whatever size the night allows it to reach. This decoupling, the reduced functional connectivity between the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex, is not a metaphor. It is not a convenient shorthand that researchers use to gesture at something more complicated. It is a measurable feature of the sleeping, deprived brain that neuroimaging has actually observed, the activation patterns in those two regions showing reduced coherence with each other, reduced coordination. The two no longer speaking to each other with the same fluency they manage after rest. The image of the loose cable is more literal than it might sound, something that in the rested brain runs as a tight, well-functioning circuit becomes, after a night without sleep, a circuit with increased resistance and reduced signal transfer. And you feel the consequences of that not as a technical observation about your prefrontal connectivity, but as the experience of lying in the dark and watching a thought about something that you know, somewhere at a distance, is manageable, and being completely unable to actually feel it that way, and finding that inability frightening in itself, which only adds to the load. There is more to this than the amygdala growing louder, though, because the picture that the research fills in over the years following Yu and Walker's 2007 paper involves a quality of distortion that is, if anything, more disorienting than mere amplification. It is not simply that the brain responds more strongly to genuinely negative things when it has not slept. It is that the brain begins to misclassify. It begins to read things that are not threats as though they were. Matthew Walker and his colleagues, and separately a research team led by Andrea Goldstein-Piekarski, working in the Journal of Neuroscience in 2015, established that sleep-deprived brains show a specific and measurable tendency to classify neutral faces as threatening, not to feel more alarmed by an already alarming face. To look at a face that carries no particular emotional signal, a face that a well-rested brain would simply register as neutral, and instead register it as hostile or suspicious or dangerous. The calibration of the threat detection system has been shifted. The threshold at which it fires has been lowered. Things that did not warrant a threat reading now get one. And if you carry that principle out of the laboratory and into the bedroom and into the specific quality of the thought that is visiting you tonight, it has a very concrete implication. The worry itself, whatever it is not being appraised on arrival by a brain that is running its standard assessment software. It is being appraised by a brain whose threat detection threshold is lower than usual, whose sense of what constitutes a genuine danger has been recalibrated downward, and whose moderating system is less able to apply the corrective reading. A situation that your well-rested brain would tag as something to keep an eye on becomes, in the hands of this particular assessment machinery, something categorically more alarming. Not because new information has arrived, not because the situation has changed, but because the instrument doing the measuring has itself been altered, and you are not awake enough at 2 a.m. to notice that the instrument is the problem, because the very faculties you would need in order to notice that are among the first ones affected. Walker and his colleagues, with Erin Wamsley and others, published in Psychological Bulletin in 2009 a paper whose title gives away its argument, Overnight Therapy: The Role of Sleep in Emotional Brain Processing, and what that paper and the related work of Goldstein and Walker summarizing the field in the Annual Review of Clinical Psychology in 2014 make clear is that the bias introduced by sleep loss is not a general bias toward all emotional experience. It is a bias that tilts specifically toward the aversive, toward the threatening, toward the negative. You do not become globally more emotional in the way that is sometimes described as though you will cry at commercials and laugh too loudly at jokes. You become more precisely oriented toward the category of things that could go wrong, could hurt you, could be larger or more serious than they appeared yesterday. The tilt is toward the aversive. And if you were lying awake, wondering whether a situation in your life is a problem worth worrying about, you have set that question in front of a brain that is operating with a systematic bias toward answering yes. William Kilgore, reviewing the effects of sleep deprivation on cognition in a volume called Progress in Brain Research in 2010. And the work of other researchers, including a team that used positron emission tomography to directly measure metabolic activity in different brain regions after sleep deprivation, contribute another piece of the picture that is worth settling into slowly. The prefrontal cortex is expensive to run. It is one of the most metabolically demanding structures in the brain. It requires a significant and continuous supply of glucose to do its work, and the work it is doing is not simple work. The work of perspective, the work of contextualizing, the work of running an incoming signal through a rich model of the world and coming back with something more nuanced than raw alarm. That is not cheap computation. And what the evidence shows is that under the pressure of sustained wakefulness, under the accumulating sleep pressure that builds across a long day and into the night and through the small hours of a night that is not providing the rest the system needs, the prefrontal cortex is among the first regions to show functional decline. Not the last, not somewhere in the middle. The first. The break goes first. There is something almost architectural about this that is worth sitting with. If you were designing a system and you knew it was going to degrade under pressure, and you were given a choice about which components to protect and which to allow to degrade first, you would not, presumably, choose to protect the alarm and sacrifice the evaluator. You would do the reverse. You would make sure that the part of the system capable of nuanced judgment was the last thing to go, because without it you are left with raw signals and no way to accurately interpret them. But evolution did not design the brain around the specific challenge of lying awake at 2 in the morning, worrying about something that will be fine by noon. Evolution built a system in which the alarm is robust and the evaluator is expensive, and when energy and regulatory resources become scarce, the expensive thing is rationed first. So the alarm keeps going, and the evaluator quietly steps back, and in the gap between them, the night does what the night does. This does not happen only after a full night without sleep, which is worth saying clearly. The dramatic number, the 60% figure, comes from a study of total sleep deprivation, one complete night without sleep. Because that is the cleanest experimental design. But the broader literature on sleep and fatigue, the research summarized in the work of Kilgore and others who have tracked cognitive function across the arc of extended wakefulness, establishes that you do not need to have skipped a whole night for this system to begin showing signs of strain. Prefrontal regulatory resources measurably decline with hours of continuous wakefulness. This is not a cliff edge where nothing changes until you hit 24 hours awake and then everything collapses. It is a gradient, a slope that begins gently in the hours after you wake up, and steepens across the afternoon, and grows steeper still in the evening, and by the time you are lying awake at 2 in the morning after a full day of ordinary demands, the system has been running for a long time, not crashed, not absent, but running below its rested capacity. Rested you, and 2 in the morning, after a long day, you are not operating with the same regulatory hardware, even if you slept reasonably the night before. And this is the thing that the science makes clear and that almost no one seems to have been told directly. It is not a personal failure, not a sign of weakness, not evidence that you are less capable of handling your life than other people, or that the thing you are worrying about is as serious as it currently feels, or that your brain is malfunctioning in some way that requires intervention. What it is a documented, measurable, essentially universal feature of human neurophysiology. The prefrontal cortex loses its regulatory grip under sustained wakefulness, and the amygdala does not, and the result is a specific and predictable distortion in the way that any incoming piece of threatening information is assessed. Every person with a human brain who has ever lain awake at 2 in the morning watching a worry expand has been experiencing this. Not a character flaw wearing the costume of anxiety, a physiological phenomenon wearing the costume of a personal problem. When you and Walker published their findings in Current Biology in 2007, they were documenting something that every person who has ever had a 2 in the morning thought had already lived through. What they were adding was the mechanism, the explanation, the thing underneath the experience that makes it make sense. And the mechanism is not complicated once you have it. 2 regions. One that detects threat. One that evaluates it. A cable between them. Fatigue pulls the cable loose. The detector keeps going. The evaluator goes quiet. The thought grows. That is the whole of it. That is what is happening in the room right now. There is one more dimension to the research that is worth bringing into this, one more piece of what is known, and it sits at the edge of the territory this video is covering, but it belongs here because it is the piece of evidence that removes any remaining possibility of this being a minor or marginal effect. In a paper published in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry in 2016, Michael Perlis and his colleagues looked at the relationship between nocturnal wakefulness and the risk of self-harm, and what they found, adjusting carefully for the number of people who were awake at different hours, was that the risk was disproportionately elevated during the biological night. This is not the most comfortable fact in this dossier, and it will not be dwelt on here. But it belongs in this conversation because it establishes something important, the distortion that makes a manageable worry feel unmanageable at 2 am is not a gentle cognitive bias that nudges your assessment by a small and largely inconsequential amount. The same mechanism operating at the darker end of the spectrum of human distress is real enough and strong enough to affect something as fundamental as how a person appraises their own situation and their own life. The night version of a thought is not a slightly different reading of the same material. It is, in some circumstances, and for some people, a categorically different reading. And the research, in naming that, is not trying to frighten anyone. It is trying to establish, with the weight of serious evidence, that the distortion is real, that it has been measured, that it is not imagined. For most people, on most nights, the consequence of the distortion is not that dramatic. It is this, a worry about money, or a relationship, or a decision that needs to be made, or something that was said in a meeting, or something that was not said, arrives in the dark, and it is bigger than it was at 4 in the afternoon, and it is harder to put down, and by the time the light comes back, it has contracted again to something that feels, if not trivial, at least dealable with. The mechanism is the same mechanism, the same asymmetry, the same prefrontal cortex quietly losing its grip while the amygdala keeps going. The same threat bias applied to neutral or mildly worrying material and producing something that looks, from the inside, exactly like a catastrophe. And what Goldstein and Walker, summarizing the field in 2014, make clear is that this tilt is not toward emotion in general, it is toward threat, toward the aversive, toward the category of things that could harm you. Which means that if you are the kind of person who lies awake at night with a specific worry, you are not simply going to feel your feelings more intensely than usual. You are going to assess the worry through machinery that has been systematically biased toward the conclusion that, yes, this is a problem. Yes, this could go badly. Yes, the worst case is the realistic one. And you are going to do that without the full function of the region that would normally step in and say, gently but firmly, let us look at this in proportion. Let us put it in context. Let us remember the other times a thing that felt like this turned out to be fine. That region is quiet. Not gone. Not destroyed. Quiet, running at reduced capacity, available in some diminished form, which is why you can sometimes, with effort, talk yourself part-way down from a tam catastrophe. But not fully, not the way you can in the morning, because the effort itself is drawing on the very system that is running on fumes. Trying to reappraise a thought at 2 am using your prefrontal cortex is a little like trying to use a dimmer switch when the electricity supply to the switch has been reduced. The knob turns. Something responds. But it does not go all the way to bright. The prefrontal cortex, in the taxonomy of brain structures, is a relatively late evolutionary development. It is the seat of what neuroscientists sometimes call executive function, which is a broad term for the cluster of capacities that includes planning and impulse control, and the ability to hold multiple things in mind simultaneously and evaluate them against each other, and the ability to take a present experience and contextualize it within a larger understanding of how the world works and how things tend to go. It is, in a meaningful sense, the part of the brain most responsible for what we tend to think of as mature judgment. The capacity to step back, to see the whole picture, to resist the urgency of the immediate and weigh it against the knowledge of the probable. And it is, as the research confirms again and again, the most expensive part of the system to run and the first part to feel the effects of running low. The amygdala, by contrast, is ancient. It predates the prefrontal cortex by a very long stretch of evolutionary time. It does not require nuance to do its job. Its job is simpler and more urgent: detect what might be dangerous, signal immediately, mobilize a response. It is built for speed and volume, not for precision. It does not need to be accurate about context in order to be effective. In the ancestral environment where its basic design was laid down, it was better to treat 10 ambiguous shapes in the darkness as 10 potential predators and be wrong 9 times than to assume the 10th was nothing and be wrong once in a way that ended the story entirely. The amygdala's entire functional logic is built around the asymmetric cost of getting it wrong in one direction versus the other. Better to over-respond. Better to be too loud. Better to treat the threat as real and let the slower system catch up and correct later. That logic made sense. In a different world, in a different night, it kept people alive. But the slower system that is supposed to catch up and correct is the prefrontal cortex, and when the prefrontal cortex is running at diminished capacity, the catch-up does not fully happen. And the amygdala's first reading stands 60% louder than it would have been in a well-rested brain, biased toward the aversive, misclassifying neutral signals as threatening, filling the room with its account of the situation. And that account feels, from the inside, like clarity. That is the thing that makes it so hard to dismiss. It does not feel like malfunction. It feels like finally seeing clearly, without the comfortable fictions that the daytime conveniently provides. As though the day is the distortion and the night is the honest reckoning. As though the management of the thought in the light is a kind of suppression, and what is happening now, in the dark, is the truth coming through. This is a very old idea. There are names for it in many cultures and many centuries, the idea that the night hours carry a special kind of revelation, that the thoughts that come at 3 in the morning are the ones that matter, the ones the busy day was drowning out. The hour of the wolf, the witching hour. The idea that darkness strips the protective padding from things and shows them as they really are. The research does not support this. The research says the reverse. The thought that comes at 2 am is being assessed by a brain with a tilted instrument, running with a weakened brake, biased toward threat, unable to fully apply the proportioning mechanism that the rested brain manages without effort. The night version is not the truth. It is a distortion presented with such vividness and in such silence that it is nearly indistinguishable from insight. The daytime version, the one that by 10 in the morning looks manageable, is not the comforting fiction. It is the more accurate reading, produced by a brain with its full complement of evaluative machinery restored. The instrument is working again. The cable is reconnected, and what the instrument reads, with the full function of the medial prefrontal cortex brought back to bear on the same material, is something smaller, something that belongs to the category of things that can be dealt with, thought through, addressed, survived. Every person who has ever woken up the morning after a 2am catastrophe and found the thought had quietly deflated knows this from the inside. The data is the life. The evidence is personal and abundant and entirely unexamined. How many times has the thing that seemed insurmountable at 2 a.m. been, by the time you had a cup of coffee and stood by a window in daylight? Something you could see the edges of, something that had a shape and a size rather than filling the entire available space. How many times? And yet the night version always arrives with the same authority, the same terrible sense of finality, the same conviction that this time it really is as serious as it seems. This time the night is right and the morning is wrong, but the night has never been right. That is what the research shows, and that is what your own history shows, and in a little while we will spend some time with the implications of that, with what it means to have that evidence and be able to use it. For now, the mechanism, the 60%, the loose cable, the brake that goes first because the brake is expensive and the night is long. There is a moment sometimes in the experience of a tam thought when you catch yourself thinking that if you could just reason your way through it, just think clearly enough, just marshal the arguments properly, you would be able to arrive at the conclusion that everything is fine and believe it. And this effort, this attempt to think your way to proportion using the cognitive tools available at 2 a.m, is sincere and understandable and largely futile. Not because you are not intelligent enough, not because the problem is actually as serious as it feels, but because the tool you are reaching for is precisely the tool that is running below capacity. Trying to engage cognitive reappraisal, which is the formal name for the mental operation of deliberately re-evaluating a situation in a more proportionate light, at 2 a.m. after a long day, is the cognitive equivalent of trying to start a car with a battery that has been running the headlights all day. Something happens. It turns over. But it does not fully catch, and the failure feels, from the inside, like confirmation that the problem really is as bad as the 2 a.m. reading suggests, because if you could think your way out of it, surely you would have by now. You would not. Not at 2 a.m. Not with the prefrontal cortex at reduced capacity, and the amygdala running hot, and the functional connection between them weakened by hours of continuous wakefulness. The instrument is the problem, not the thinker, the instrument. And this distinction, that the problem is with the machinery and not with the person operating it, is the most important reframe the research offers. Because the alternative explanation, the one that most people quietly carry around, is that when the thought feels insurmountable at tam, it feels that way because it is. Because the night strips the pretense and reveals the real scale. Because you are finally, without the distraction of the day, seeing it clearly. And the science says that this is precisely backwards. The scale that the thought reaches at 2 a.m. is not its real scale. It is the scale it reaches when the mechanism that supplies proportion has gone quiet, and the mechanism that amplifies threat has not. What you are seeing clearly is not the problem. What you are seeing clearly is the output of an asymmetric system. And asymmetric output is not the same thing as truth. Breathe slowly with that for a moment. The room is the same room it was an hour ago. The thought is the same thought it was in the afternoon. The only thing that has changed is the state of the machinery doing the measuring, and the machinery that measures when it is running below its rested capacity systematically overreads, always in the same direction, always toward larger, always toward worse, always toward the version of the situation that requires the most alarm. Not because the situation warrants it, because the machinery is built to err in that direction, and when the brake on that tendency is running low, it errs more dramatically than usual. 60%. That is the number. 60% greater amplitude in the threat response, in a brain that has gone without sleep, looking at the same image that a rested brain looks at with something closer to equanimity. Not a personal coefficient. Not a measure of your particular psychological robustness or fragility. A measurement of the machinery in a laboratory under controlled conditions, published in a peer-reviewed journal and replicated and extended in the years since. The machinery produces a 60% louder alarm signal when it has not had the rest it needs, and it does this while simultaneously quieting the part of the system designed to hear that alarm and say, calmly, here is what it actually means. And that is not who you are at 2am. That is what your brain is doing at 2am. They are not the same thing, and the difference between those two sentences is the whole of what we are doing here tonight. The clock has its own thing to say about this, and we are almost ready to hear it. There is a name for the hours in which the clock does what it does to a human brain, a name that a group of researchers chose carefully and well, and there is a physiological low tide that the body drops into around the center of the dark that goes beyond tiredness, that is not about the length of the day, but about the position of the clock. We said we would go there next, and we will slowly, as the night deepens around you and the room grows quieter and your body settles further into the bed. Because the story of the clock and the dark and the vigil the nervous system keeps in the absence of light is the next layer down, and it belongs to the part of this that is not about fatigue at all, but about what time it is. There is a name for it. That is where we should begin. Because one of the most quietly reassuring things the research offers is the fact that it has been named at all. That a group of scientists looked at the evidence from across neuroscience and sleep medicine and chronobiology and chose a phrase that describes a real phenomenon with a real boundary, a real set of hours. A real and documented set of effects that go beyond how long you have been awake, beyond the accumulated weight of the day, beyond the simple arithmetic of depletion. The name they chose is this, the mind after midnight. And it comes from a paper published in 2021 in Frontiers in Network Physiology by a team including Andrew Tubbs and Michael Grandner, who proposed it not as a settled law, but as a synthesizing model, a framework that gathers a body of converging evidence and gives it a common shape. It is a leading hypothesis rather than a single experiment. But it is a well-built one, and the evidence it gathers is real, and what it says is something worth staying awake a moment longer to hear. What it says is that nocturnal wakefulness, being awake during the biological night, changes neurological and physiological function in a way that is separate from, and additional to, simple fatigue. That the same situation, the same thought, the same worry about the same job, or the same relationship, or the same number in the same bank account, is appraised more negatively. Evaluated with a more negative valence, perceived as more threatening and less manageable, not only because you are tired, but because of what time it is. Because the clock itself, the biological clock inside you, the one that is not metaphorical, the one that is a physical structure in the brain, doing a real job, is in a specific phase of its rotation. And that phase changes the chemistry and the circuitry in ways that tilt the whole system in a direction. The direction is toward threat, toward negative affect, toward impaired executive function and altered reward processing, toward, in the language of the researchers who named it, a different kind of mind, not a weaker one, not a more honest one, a different one, operating under a different set of conditions, producing a different read on the same material. That word, different, is doing important work here. Not worse in some absolute sense, not evidence of anything broken or defective, just genuinely a different state, the way the tide is genuinely different from the water that will return to the shore in the morning. The tide is not the river being weak. It is the river doing what rivers do in response to forces that are real and external and not about the river's character. And the mind after midnight is not the mind being honest or the mind being broken. It is the mind doing what minds do when the clock is in a specific position and the light is gone, and the particular chemistry of that hour is present in the blood and the tissue and the cerebrospinal fluid and the firing patterns of neurons that respond to all of those things, whether you want them to or not. Which brings us to the low tide itself, because there is a physiological low point built into the human night that most people have never been told about in any useful detail. And it sits almost exactly at the hours when the worst of the 2am worry tends to arrive. It is not one thing. It is several systems reaching their floor simultaneously, a convergence of biological lows that would, if you could see it as a chart, look like multiple lines dropping together toward the same valley at the same hour, and then beginning, slowly, to rise again before the alarm clock sounds. The first of those lines is core body temperature. The human body, across the course of a 24-hour day, runs a cycle of internal temperature that drops as the night progresses and reaches its minimum somewhere in the early morning hours, broadly around 4 or 5 in the morning. This is not about the temperature of the room, though that matters too. This is the temperature of the body itself, the deep internal heat that the brain carefully regulates as part of the same circadian orchestration that governs sleep and waking. The drop begins in the evening, which is part of why you feel pleasantly drowsy as the night comes on. The body cooling itself toward sleep, like a house turning down the thermostat after dinner. And the floor, that minimum point, arrives in the small hours, in exactly the window when the world feels most unreachable and the thought running through your mind feels most immovable. The body at its temperature minimum is not the body at its most capable. It is the body at its most deeply committed to a state of rest it was designed to be in. When wakefulness intrudes at that hour, it meets a system that is at its lowest prepared state for the demands wakefulness makes. Not designed for it. Not ready for it. Running the hardware of consciousness on a chassis that is physiologically doing something else. The second line on that chart belongs to cortisol. Cortisol, which many people know as a stress hormone, which is accurate but incomplete, runs its own circadian curve through the 24 hours, and its low point, its nadir, arrives around midnight. So at midnight the body is at the bottom of its cortisol curve, which might sound reassuring. Low cortisol sounds calm. And in some ways the phrasing is misleading, But what it means practically is that one of the systems involved in mobilizing a response to challenge, in focusing attention and preparing action, is at its flaw. The body is not in a state of high alert and readiness at midnight, it is at a trough. And then the cortisol begins to rise again, a rise that is steep and early, climbing through the pre-dawn hours in what chronobiologists call the cortisol awakening response, a surge of cortisol that reaches its peak around the time of waking, which is part of how the body prepares you to meet the day. This matters because of what it means for the person who is awake at 4 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, following a thought that will not stop. At 4 in the morning, cortisol is not at its midnight floor anymore. It is rising. The pre-dawn hours are, paradoxically, not the quietest part of the hormonal landscape. They are the beginning of the body's chemical mobilization for the coming day, a mobilization that has not been asked to wait because a person decided to lie awake and worry. The cortisol climbs on its own schedule, indifferent to the fact that morning has not arrived yet, indifferent to the fact that the person trying to process a worry at 4 in the morning is doing it not against a backdrop of calm, but against a backdrop of a stress hormone on the way up. The rumination at 4 in the morning is not happening in still water. It is happening in a current that is already beginning to run. The third line belongs to melatonin. Melatonin is secreted by a small structure at the center of the brain called the pineal gland, and its release is triggered by darkness through a pathway that runs from the eyes to a region of the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the brain's master clock, the small cluster of neurons that keeps the body's circadian timing synchronized with the world. When darkness falls and the eyes report the absence of light to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the signal goes out and melatonin begins to rise in the blood, climbing through the evening and the early night and reaching its peak somewhere in the middle of the dark, roughly around the hours of 2 to 4 in the morning. Melatonin is not a sleeping pill, it is a signal. A chemical message the body sends to itself that reads, "It is night, this is night, conduct yourself accordingly." The body in the middle of the night, at melatonin peak, is operating in a chemical environment that is as different from noon as a winter afternoon is from midsummer. Not only psychologically, not only in terms of the subjective feeling, but at the level of receptors and hormones and the particular balance of neurotransmitters that shape how information is processed, how emotional salience is assigned, how threats are weighted against resources. The same thought introduced into that environment. At 2 in the morning, at melatonin peak and cortisol nadir and body temperature floor, will be processed differently than it will be at 10 in the morning, with cortisol at its waking peak and body temperature rising and melatonin gone from the blood entirely. This is not speculation, it is what the biology describes. And what it means for the person lying awake is simply this: the hour changes the instrument. You are not thinking about the problem more clearly at 2 am because you have fewer distractions. You are thinking about it with a brain operating inside a different biochemical context, one that was not designed for the demands you are making of it, one that will evaluate the same evidence and arrive at a different answer than the one it will arrive at in the morning. Both readings came from you. Only one of them came from the instrument in a state suited to the task. And then there is the dark itself, which is not passive, which is not simply the absence of light in the way a room is simply a room in the absence of furniture. The dark does something to the nervous system that light does not. This is measurable. It has been measured in a laboratory at the National Institute of Mental Health in experiments conducted by a researcher named Christian Grien and his colleagues, and what the measurements show is this: the identical cue, the same neutral or mildly threatening stimulus, presented to a person in the dark and then presented to the same person in the light, produces a larger fear response in the dark. This is called the dark-enhanced startle, and it is not a metaphor or an impression or a cultural association. It is a physiological measurement, an increase in the amplitude of the startle reflex in darkness versus light, measured in the body's own signals, consistent across participants, documented and published. What this means is that the room you are lying in is not a neutral container for your thoughts. The darkness of the room is itself a variable. The same thought, the same fear, the same appraised threat introduced into a dark room will produce a larger fear response in your nervous system than it would if the lights were on. Not because anything about the thought changed, not because anything about you changed. Because darkness measurably potentiates the threat response to the identical stimulus. The dark turns up the volume on whatever you are listening to, and if what you are listening to at 2 am is a worry, the dark makes that worry louder. This is not poetic language for a real effect. This is a direct description of what the research found. There is a reason for this, or rather there is a history behind it. A long history that predates laboratories and peer review by a considerable distance. A history that is written not in journals, but in the particular wiring of a nervous system that evolved in conditions very different from the ones most people now live in. Human beings are a diurnal species, day-active, designed across the long span of evolutionary time to be alert and mobile and capable during daylight, and at rest and sheltered during the dark. And darkness, for most of that time, was not an inconvenience or an aesthetic state. It was the period of maximum predation risk. The period during which threats could not be seen, could not be tracked, could not be responded to with the speed and accuracy that daylight made possible. The period during which staying alive required a different kind of attentiveness, a heightened baseline vigilance, a readiness to interpret ambiguous signals as threats rather than to give them the benefit of the doubt, because in darkness the cost of a false negative, of dismissing a sound as nothing when it was something, was asymmetrically higher than the cost of a false positive, of startling at a branch when no predator was there. This is not the situation most people lie in when they are awake at 2 am in their own beds. The threat that shaped that wiring is not the threat waiting in the living room. But the wiring does not know that. The nervous system does not update in real time based on architectural developments and changes in the local fauna. It carries its history. And part of that history is a setting, still present, still active, that reads darkness as a condition requiring heightened vigilance, that assigns greater threat weight to ambiguous stimuli in the absence of light. That turns up the gain on the fear response, because the dark has always been the time to turn it up. This is what Grillen's dark-enhanced startle measurements are catching. Not a malfunction. An ancient and well-calibrated feature of a system that was built for a world that no longer exists in quite the same form, deployed into conditions for which it was not specifically designed, doing its best. Which in this case means doing precisely what you do not need it to do at 2 am, when you are already awake and already worried and the room is already dark. And there is one more thing the research wants to say about the hours themselves, about what nocturnal wakefulness means biologically, and it needs to be said with the care it deserves. Because the evidence that the mind after midnight is genuinely, measurably different from the daytime mind is not only found in studies of startle reflexes and amygdala reactivity and prefrontal metabolism. It is also found in epidemiology, in data about what happens to human beings during the biological night when the mechanisms we have been describing reach their peak. There is research published in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry in 2016 by Michael Perlis and colleagues and reviewed in the Mind After Midnight paper itself, showing that the risk of self-harm and suicidality is disproportionately elevated during the biological night, even after adjusting for the simple fact that more people are awake at some hours than others. Nocturnal wakefulness is an independent risk window, a period in which the machinery we have been describing, the amplified threat response, the depleted regulatory system, the altered appraisal, is operating at its most extreme. This is not a detail to dwell on in alarm. It is evidence of the same kind, from a different and more severe end of the same spectrum. It is the research's way of confirming that the effect we have been describing is not a minor fluctuation, not a small statistical trend, not a rounding error in a questionnaire about mood. It is a documented, serious, real change in how the human brain processes its situation during the biological night, serious enough that it leaves a mark in population-level data about outcomes. And if it is real enough and large enough to do that, it is certainly real enough and large enough to make an ordinary worry, a worry about money or health or a relationship or a decision, feel at 2 am like the end of something. Not because the worry is uniquely terrible, because the hours are. If you have been told, or if you have told yourself, that your 2 am mind is seeing clearly, that the night lifts a veil, that the day keeps politely in place, that what you feel in the small hours is the truth your waking life is too busy or too defended to hold. That ancient and appealing idea is not what the evidence describes. It is almost exactly backwards. The idea has a name in folklore. People have called 2 and 3 in the morning the hour of the wolf, a phrase from Swedish tradition, the hour when the sick are closest to death and the healthy are closest to fear, and there is a long human history of treating the thoughts that arrive at that hour as significant, as prophetic, as the secret truths the noisy day conceals. 3 in the morning has a reputation for honesty that the afternoon has never been granted. But honesty requires a calibrated instrument. It requires the machinery of appraisal to be working. And what the research describes in detail with numbers and named mechanisms and replicated experimental findings is that the machinery of appraisal is precisely what is not working well at 3 in the morning. The amygdala reading threat at 60% higher amplitude than it will in the morning is not a more honest instrument. It is a louder one. Loudness is not accuracy. The prefrontal cortex, decoupled from the fear generator, running on the metabolic equivalent of fumes, is not a more perceptive instrument. It is a quieter one. And quieter, in this context, does not mean calmer or more careful. It means less able to do the work of putting the alarm in its correct proportion, of saying, here is what this means, here is what it does not mean. Here is what has felt this large before and was smaller by morning. The hour of the wolf is not the hour of truth. It is the hour of the loudest alarm and the quietest break. Those two things together produce a very particular experience, and almost everyone has had it, and almost nobody has been told what it actually is. So let us be precise about what it actually is. You are lying in a dark room, which is literally amplifying your threat response to whatever you are thinking about, because darkness potentiates the startle and the fear response in a way that has been directly measured. Your body is at its temperature minimum or approaching it, a low point that is written into the circadian schedule without regard for what you would prefer. Your cortisol, if it is the pre-dawn hours, is not at rest. It is beginning to climb, running the script it runs every morning, whether morning has arrived in any meaningful sense or not. Your melatonin is at or near its peak, your body broadcasting chemically to every system the signal that this is the night, this is the deep part of the night. Conduct yourself accordingly. The part of your brain responsible for appraising threat, the amygdala, is not dampened by any of this. If anything, the evidence suggests the mechanisms that amplify it are at work, and the part of your brain responsible for putting that appraisal in proportion, the medial prefrontal cortex, the regulatory structure that provides context and correction, and the calm voice that says this has been survivable before, is operating with reduced metabolic resources, decoupled from the very structure it is supposed to regulate. Quieter than it will be tomorrow morning when the long day is ahead of you and not behind. The thought is exactly the same thought. The problem is the same problem. The number in the account, the unanswered message, the symptom you noticed, the decision you cannot make, the conversation that went wrong, the future you cannot see clearly. These things did not change between this afternoon and right now. What changed is the instrument doing the reading. And the instrument is doing something that has a name now. Something that has been studied and described in journals and named carefully. It is doing what it does after midnight, when the clock is where the clock is, when the dark is doing what the dark does. When the system is at the physiological low point it is built to pass through every night. When the machinery is arranged in the particular configuration that the mind after midnight hypothesis describes. This is the arrangement. This is what you are inside of, right now, if the night is deep and the room is dark and the worry is present. Which means there is something you can do with that information tonight. Right now, something that does not require any effort and does not require you to resolve anything. You can notice that you are in the hours. You can notice that the instrument is in a particular configuration, and that this configuration has a known effect on appraisal, and that the appraisal you are getting from it right now is not the last word. Is not the most accurate read, is not the judgment you would hand down if you were running this same case through the same machinery at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning in a lit room with coffee in your hand and the ordinary sounds of the day around you. The thought is real. The feeling is real. The worry has real content that may well deserve real attention. And the size of it, the weight of it, the apparent finality of it, the sense that it is larger than everything else and has no solution and never will, that part is the instrument. That part is the hour. And the hour will change. There is still more to say about why it changes, about the mechanism that makes the morning read different from the midnight read, and about what you can do with the thought before you fall asleep to make it smaller when you find it again in the daylight. We are moving toward that. But the ground we have just covered, the clock and the dark and the low tide and the name the researchers gave to the hours in which all of it converges, this is worth pausing inside for a moment. Because it is not a small thing to be told, for the first time or the first time in these terms, that there is a documented, measurable, named effect that explains a thing you have felt hundreds of times and almost certainly explained to yourself as a personal failing, as something wrong with you specifically, as evidence of a particular weakness or fragility or tendency toward catastrophe that other people, presumably, do not have. They have it. Everyone lying awake in the middle of the night has it. The mechanisms we have been describing do not select for people with anxiety disorders or histories of trauma or particular temperaments or particular levels of psychological resilience. They are present in all human nervous systems because they are features, not bugs. Features of a system built to do a job in conditions that existed long before anyone had words for what was being built. The diurnal species with poor night vision needing to be vigilant in the dark. The prefrontal cortex metabolically expensive, the first to slow when the fuel runs low. The amygdala, older than the cortex in evolutionary terms, running on a different clock. Not dependent on the same fuel, still doing what it was doing long before anyone built a structure above it to regulate the signal. The dark amplifying the fear response as it has always done. The clock passing through its low point as it does every night, in every body, without exception. What is personal is the content of the worry. What is universal is the machinery that makes it feel, in this hour, like it cannot be survived. And knowing which part is which is not a cure and is not a dismissal of the content. The problem still needs attention. Some of the problems that arrive at TAM are real and serious and will require real and serious responses. But the response does not need to be designed at TAM. The response does not need to be felt in full at 2am. And the assessment of the problem's size, of whether it is manageable or unsurvivable, of whether there is a path through it or no path at all, that assessment is not one the 2am instrument is well equipped to make. The assessment will be different in the morning. Not because the problem will have changed. Because the instrument will have. And there is a second layer to what the dark and the clock are doing that we have not yet fully named, a layer that is not about hormones or brain metabolism or the startle response, but about the structure of the hours themselves, about what 2am is and is not, about what it does and does not contain. This is the next thing we need to go into together, slowly. Because it is the piece of this that may be most immediately recognizable, the piece that, when it is named, most people hear and say, yes, that is exactly what it is. I have felt that. Every time, and I did not have a word for it until now. It is about what is absent at 2am, about what the night removes, about the particular silence that is not peaceful but is instead a kind of exposure. A removal of the ordinary noise and interruption and task and other person that during the day keeps the worry in its correct proportion, not by addressing it, but simply by preventing it from running unchecked. The night takes all of that away, and without it, the thought that was there all along, the one that was present at lunch and at 3 in the afternoon and on the drive home. The one you did not stop and fully enter because there was always something else to attend to, finds itself finally in a space with no competition, no interruption, no external demand to break the loop, and it expands to fill the available room. And the room at 2am is very large and very quiet and entirely available. That is where we are headed next, into the silence, and what it does, and why the absence of correction is its own mechanism, as real and as measurable in its effects as the amygdala reactivity we counted in percentages and the cortisol curve we traced through the hours. Into the part of this where the machinery is not simply turned up, but is, in a particular and important way, turned loose. The problem is not only that the alarm is louder, it is also that the voice that usually says, "Hold on, let me check that," is not there. And we will go there now, as the night deepens a little further and your breathing slows, and the room is dark around you, and there is nothing at all that needs to be done right now. Nothing. And the story continues. And so we come to it. The silence itself, not as atmosphere, not as backdrop, but as mechanism, as something the brain responds to in a documented and specific way, something that changes what the mind does with whatever thought it happens to be holding at the moment the noise stops and the tasks are gone and the other people have left the room. There is a network in the brain that researchers call the default mode network. It is not a network that needs much introduction to anyone who has ever lain awake at 2 a.m., because you have been living inside it without knowing its name. The default mode network is what becomes active when the brain is not occupied by a directed external task. It is not rest, exactly, it is not sleep, and it is not emptiness. It is what the brain does when left to its own devices, the thinking it returns to when no other thinking is required. And the content of that thinking, when studied in laboratories and traced through imaging and reported in the decades of work that researchers like Marcus Rachel devoted to understanding it, tends to be self-referential. It tends to be about us, about our concerns and our futures and our failures and the things we have not resolved. The default mode network is, in a meaningful sense, the network of the unfinished. During the day it is interrupted, constantly and repeatedly, and without ceremony, the demands of daytime life reach in and break the thread. A meeting starts. Someone asks you something. Your phone lights up. The task list reasserts itself, the conversation turns, and with each interruption, the self-referential loop that had just been gathering a little momentum is broken, and by the time the interruption resolves and the default mode network tries to pick up where it left off, something else has already arrived to break it again. The daytime is not quiet enough to sustain a rumination. It is too full. Too insistent. The worry exists. You carried it through the whole day, through the meeting and the conversation and the drive home, but it never got a long enough run to build to the height it builds to now. Susan Nolan Hoeksema, who spent much of her career studying rumination and the conditions that sustain it, identified something that holds in the data across many different contexts and many different populations. Rumination is not simply a function of how distressing a thought is, it is also a function of what is available to compete with it. When attention is captured by something external, a task, a person, a demand, the ruminative loop is broken. When nothing external competes, it runs. And what the research shows consistently is that the absence of competing demand is not neutral. It is not simply the removal of something helpful. It is the creation of a condition in which the self-focused, worry-focused, unresolved concern-focused processing that the default mode network naturally gravitates toward can sustain itself and deepen and compound in ways that the interruption-filled daytime simply does not permit. At 2 a.m., the interruptions are gone. All of them. There is no task. There is no meeting. There is no one asking you anything. The house is quiet in a way that feels, in those moments, enormous, and the default mode network, freed from competition, does what it does. It goes to the unfinished. It finds the thought that was there all along, the one that had been waiting patiently through every interruption, and it settles into it with a thoroughness that the day never allowed. And the thought, given that much space and that much silence and that much uninterrupted time, runs, and it runs in a particular direction. Because the other piece of what the silence does, and this is the piece that the research in sensory processing and inattention makes very clear, is that it raises the signal-to-noise ratio of internal experience. During the day, there is a great deal of external sensory input. Sound and light and movement and the presence of other bodies in the room, and all of that input competes with the internal for your attention. When the external dims, when the room goes dark and quiet and still, the internal becomes relatively louder, not because it has actually grown, but because everything that was making it seem quieter has been removed. The worry was this loud the whole time. You simply could not hear it as clearly over the noise of the day. And now the noise is gone, and the silence, which seems as though it should be peaceful, is in fact a kind of amplification, a removal of the static that was keeping the signal in proportion. None of this is weakness. It is physics in a sense. It is the straightforward consequence of removing the competition. But there is something else the night removes, something quieter and perhaps more important than the interruptions, something that matters a great deal to how accurate the worry's appraisal of itself actually is. And that is the other person. During the day, we are surrounded by the possibility of reality testing. The appraisal the worried mind generates, the story it tells about the problem, the scale it assigns to it, the probability it calculates, the weight it gives to the worst-case interpretation, is constantly available to be checked against another human being. You can say it out loud. You can say, "Here is what I am thinking, here is what I am afraid might happen," and someone else can hear it and respond and either confirm or correct. And what we know from decades of cognitive behavioral research, from the clinical evidence accumulated across many different treatment modalities and many different populations, is that saying a fear out loud to another person is one of the most reliable and immediate ways to reduce it. Not because the other person says something particularly wise, not because they solve the problem, but because the act of externalizing the thought, of translating it from an internal loop into words offered to another consciousness, changes its character. It reveals its edges. It makes it possible to see where the catastrophe has been inflated beyond what the evidence supports. At 2 am, that check is not available. The person who might hear it is asleep beside you, or in another room, or simply not there, and the thought that would shrink the moment it was spoken is instead kept wholly inside, where it is checked only against itself, confirmed only by its own internal logic, corrected by nothing external. The appraisal that the worried mind generates at 2 am never gets tested. It runs and it compounds and it builds its case, and there is no opposing counsel. There is only the thought, and the silence, and the dark, and the absolutely unchallenged sense that yes, this is as serious as it feels, because nothing has arrived to suggest otherwise. This is not a small thing. The social correction of distorted appraisals is not a luxury. It is one of the ordinary and largely invisible mechanisms by which the mind maintains something like accuracy about the scale of its problems. And the night, simply by removing the other people, removes that correction for the entire duration of the dark hours. Whatever the worry tells you about itself at 2 am, you will believe, because there is nothing there to argue back. Some people, and you may be one of them, are more vulnerable to this than others, and the research on chronotype, on whether a person is naturally inclined toward morning wakefulness or toward the later hours of the night, finds a real difference here. Those who lean toward the evening, the ones researchers call evening types, report higher rates of rumination and greater mood vulnerability than morning types, and part of that vulnerability may be precisely this, that when the night is their natural territory, they are more likely to be awake in it, more likely to be inside the silence for longer, and more exposed to the conditions the dark hours impose. The mechanism is the same for everyone, but the duration of exposure is not. And there is another loop the research makes plain, a loop that is important to understand, not because it adds blame, it does not, but because understanding it is part of understanding what is happening to you. Anxiety and worry fragment sleep. They delay the onset of sleep, they interrupt its continuity. They break the architecture of it in ways the research has documented thoroughly across meta-analyses involving many thousands of participants. And poor sleep, in turn, worsens next-day anxiety. The prefrontal resources that returned after last night's sleep are already reduced because last night's sleep was disrupted by the anxiety that the night before produced, which means that tonight's proportion machinery is starting from a slightly lower baseline than it would have if last week had been peaceful. The 2am spiral is both symptom and cause. It is what happens to a person who is caught in this loop. And the loop is not a character flaw, and it is not evidence of weakness, and it does not require a label to be taken seriously. It requires understanding, which is what we are doing, right now, in the dark. And here is the understanding that matters most, the one that this whole long account has been moving toward. The one that is available to you not as a comforting abstraction, but as an empirical fact backed by the same kind of research that produced the 60% number, and the decoupling, and the dark enhanced startle, and the physiological low point, and all the rest of it. The daylight version is the accurate one. Not because it is more optimistic, not because the daylight flatters you or protects you from hard truths, but because the machinery that produces accurate appraisals, the prefrontal cortex's regulatory connection to the amygdala, the reappraisal capacity that allows a mind to look at a situation from more than one angle and weight it against evidence rather than against fear, is impaired by fatigue and sleep loss and restored by rest. This is what the research shows. Cognitive reappraisal, the deliberate and effortful re-evaluation of a situation, the ability to hold a worry at some distance and ask, is this actually as large as it feels? Does the evidence support this interpretation, or has the threat system selected for it? That capacity is measurably degraded when you are tired and at the low end of your circadian rhythm, and it comes back online after sleep. The morning is not more naive than the night. The morning is better calibrated. The reappraisal machinery is back online, and it is doing its job, and what it tells you the problem looks like is in fact the more accurate reading of the problem. And then there is what happens in the hours between midnight and morning, while sleep is present and doing its work. Researchers including Els van der Helm, working with Matthew Walker at the University of California, Berkeley, published a finding in Current Biology in 2011 that bears directly on this. They found that sleep, specifically sleep that contained REM, the stage characterized by rapid eye movements, and by a particular neurological state that includes, among other things, a significant reduction in the release of noradrenaline, a stress-related neurochemical, appeared to reduce the emotional charge of memories. A difficult or distressing memory that was presented to participants before sleep produced a smaller amygdala response when it was presented again after a night's sleep than it did when participants simply stayed awake for the same interval. The sleep had, in some measurable sense, detuned the emotional reactivity attached to the memory. The event itself had not changed. The facts of it had not changed. But the emotional force with which the brain responded to it was quieter after the sleep than before. This is why Walker and others began using the phrase overnight therapy to describe what REM sleep appears to do, with the important caveat that this is still an area of active scientific discussion, that the precise role of REM specifically versus sleep in general remains a live question among researchers, and that nothing here is settled with the finality of a closed case. But the broad direction of the finding is consistent. Sleep is not simply a pause in the processing of emotional experience. It appears to be a part of the processing of emotional experience. The morning is calmer, in part, because the night did something. Not nothing. It worked, and part of what it produced was a reduction in the force with which the worried thought strikes the mind when the morning arrives and you recall that you had it. The 10 o'clock version of the worry is smaller, not only because the prefrontal cortex has recovered, it is smaller because the sleep between the worry and the morning has, apparently, been doing something with it. Gently, without your involvement, without your effort, in the hours while you were somewhere else entirely, the biology was adjusting the gain. And now the practical part, the part that this has been saving for the end. Because all of this science, the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex and the decoupling and the cortisol nadir and the dark-enhanced startle and the default mode network and the overnight therapy of REM, all of it is more useful to you than simply as an explanation, though the explanation is already, in itself, something. The explanation alone is valuable, because it converts a felt experience from a sign of personal weakness into a documented, named physiological phenomenon. That conversion is not trivial. It is the difference between lying awake at 2 a.m. thinking something is wrong with me and lying awake at 2 a.m. thinking this is what a brain does when it is tired and in the dark, and there is science for this, and I am not broken. But there is also a thing to do, a specific, small, concrete thing that a real study measured and found to work, and it requires 5 minutes and something to write with. Michael Scullin and colleagues published a study in the Journal of Experimental Psychology General in 2018, in which participants were asked to spend 5 minutes writing before bed. One group wrote about things they had already completed. The other group wrote a specific to-do list for the coming days, tasks they needed to accomplish, worries they had about things not yet done, the unfinished business that the default mode network would otherwise have been left to carry into the night. The group that wrote the to-do list fell asleep measurably faster than the group that wrote about completed tasks. The more specific and concrete the to-do list, the faster they fell asleep. What the writing appeared to do was transfer the cognitive load of the unfinished, the open loops, the parked concerns, the things the mind keeps returning to, because returning to them is the only way it knows to signal that they have not yet been resolved, from the internal loop to the page. The page can hold it. The page does not need sleep. The page will be there in the morning, exactly as written, requiring no maintenance, no monitoring, no vigil. And so the mind, reassured that the unfinished has been recorded somewhere outside itself, was released from the job of keeping it active through the night. This is the same logic that underlies the expressive writing work that James Pennebaker has spent decades documenting. Writing about emotional concerns, not necessarily solving them, not necessarily finding the answer, but simply putting them into words and getting them outside the body, changes how they are processed. The research on this is wide and has been replicated across many different kinds of concerns and many different populations, and what it consistently finds is that the act of language, the act of translation from internal loop to written word, produces measurable effects on psychological well-being and, in some contexts, on physical health outcomes as well. The thought that is kept entirely inside, circling and untested and never given a form outside itself, behaves differently than the thought that has been written down. The writing is not a cure, but it is a change in the relationship between the person and the thought. And the change matters. So here is the self-test. Here is the 5-minute thing. When the thought arrives tonight, and it may come at 2 a.m. in the way it always comes, carrying the weight it always carries, you do not have to argue with it. You do not have to solve it. You do not have to convince yourself that it is wrong, because at 2 a.m. your reappraisal machinery is not at its best, and the argument will not land cleanly, and the worry will simply reassert itself the moment the argument finishes. You do not have to do any of that. You can write it down. Take the worry, exactly as it feels, exactly as large as it currently appears, and put it on paper, not to fix it, not to minimize it, just to move it from the loop inside to the page outside. And then, and this is the part that matters, you go to sleep. And in the morning, when the prefrontal cortex has returned from its long night's work of recovery, when the reappraisal machinery is back online, when the amygdala has returned to its baseline sensitivity and is no longer responding to ordinary things at the amplified reactivity that the tired and the dark and the cortisol nadir produced, in the morning you read what you wrote, and you watch it change size. Not always to nothing. Some problems are real, and the morning confirms it. But the catastrophe, the absolute certainty of disaster, the sense that the worst interpretation is the accurate one, and that no recovery is possible, and that the scale of this is exactly what it felt like at 2 a.m., that part will almost certainly look different. Smaller, more workable, a thing with edges and a possible next step rather than an infinite and unnavigable darkness. The problem may remain. The size of it will not. There is something that circulates in popular conversation about this kind of end-of-day mental fragility, a framing you may have encountered under the name ego depletion. The idea that willpower and self-control operate like a muscle that exhausts during the day and runs out by evening, leaving a person vulnerable to every poor decision and every catastrophic thought that the stronger, earlier self would have handled better. There is something intuitively appealing in this framing, and for a while it was quite widely cited and quite influentially received. But the scientific grounding for it has not held up. A large registered replication report published in Perspectives on Psychological Science in 2016, in which many independent laboratories around the world attempted to reproduce the core findings that the ego depletion model rested on, found that they could not consistently do so. The model, at least in its strong form, has failed to replicate reliably enough to be built upon. What this means is not that nothing real happens to self-regulation across a long day. The prefrontal fatigue effects in the sleep deprivation literature are real and documented and measured in percentages we have already discussed. What it means is that the simple and clean story of willpower as a finite tank that empties is not the right story. The real story is more specific, more interesting, and more grounded in the neuroscience. The prefrontal cortex is metabolically expensive. It is among the first systems to show performance decline under the conditions of a long waking day and sleep pressure, and when it fades, it takes the break with it. That is the true mechanism. The ego depletion framing, appealing as it is not the one to rest your understanding on.
The one to rest your understanding on is this. The same worry, held in the same mind, genuinely is appraised differently at 2 a.m. than at 10 a.m. The difference is not subjective, and it is not a personal weakness, and it is not evidence of a fragile, or a dramatizing, or a less than competent self. The difference is the result of a measurable physiological state, in which the machinery of proportion is depleted and partially disconnected from the machinery of threat, while the machinery of threat continues to operate at full capacity or above it. One night of sleep loss produces roughly 60% greater amygdala reactivity to negative things. The prefrontal-amygdala connection that normally supplies the regulatory brake is reduced in functional connectivity, a decoupling that neuroimaging has photographed. The clock, independent of tiredness, tilts the appraisal toward the negative in the hours after midnight. The same situation is evaluated more darkly as a function of the biological time of day. The dark amplifies the fear response to an identical cue. The silence removes the interruptions that would break the loop. The absence of the other person removes the external check that would have corrected the story. The cortisol is at its nadir at midnight, and the body temperature is falling toward its minimum in the early morning hours, and the melatonin is at its peak, and the internal chemical environment at 2 a.m. is a deliberately and entirely different place than noon. The night is not a neutral passage. It is a specific and particular state, and the mind it produces is not the same mind that will read the morning paper. And here is what you already know, what you have known perhaps for decades, what you have lived through so many times that the pattern is unmistakable, and yet what has perhaps never been said to you plainly and with the weight it deserves. Count the times the 2 a.m. version turned out to be right. Count the mornings you woke and found the catastrophe had arrived exactly as predicted by the midnight appraisal. Count the times the thought that felt like certain knowledge at 2 a.m., the job is gone, the relationship is broken, the health is failing, the situation is genuinely unsalvageable, and there is no path through, turned out to be accurate. You are counting. Take your time. Because what the reappraisal research makes clear, and what the overnight therapy finding from Vanderhelm and Walker adds to, and what your own experience documents, if you invite it to, is that the night version of a problem has a very poor record. It has almost never been the accurate one. The morning has arrived, and the prefrontal cortex has come back online, and the reappraisal machinery has done its work, and the problem has revealed itself to be the size it actually is, which has almost always been smaller than the 2 a.m. reading. The job was difficult but manageable. The relationship needed a conversation, not an ending. The health question needed a doctor's appointment, which you made, and the answer was not the one the midnight mind was certain of. The situation had a next step, and you found it, and you moved through it, and here you are.
You have been running this experiment your entire adult life. You simply have not been invited to read the results. And the results are unambiguous. The night version has not been the accurate one. The daytime appraisal, the one produced by the rested and reconnected and reappraisal-capable prefrontal cortex, has been the better calibrated instrument. Every morning is evidence. You own a lifetime of evidence, and you do not have to take the 2 a.m. reading on faith as though it were the more honest one, as though the night were showing you something the day conceals. The science says the opposite. The day is not hiding from the truth. The night is distorting it.
Not maliciously, not as a failure of you, but mechanically, predictably, as a consequence of what the brain is and what the night does to it, documented in studies that measured it and named it and published it in the literature where it has been available to be known. You can set the 2 a.m. reading down, not because the worry is unreal, not because the problem does not exist or does not matter, but because the instrument taking the reading is not at its most accurate, and a more accurate reading is available in the morning, and you already know this, and the science has simply arrived, at last, to confirm it. The night is doing something very specific to you. It has taken the brake off the alarm and left the alarm running. It has placed you in a space where nothing external can correct the story, where the default mode network can sustain the loop without interruption, where the dark is amplifying the response to every internal cue, where the chemical environment of your own blood is at a low point that the architecture of the body builds into every day without asking your permission. None of it is your fault. All of it is documented. And all of it is temporary, in a way that is not simply reassuring, but is mechanically specific. The sleep that is coming, the morning that follows it, will restore the prefrontal regulatory capacity, will re-establish the functional connection to the amygdala, will bring the reappraisal machinery back online, will have done something quiet and restorative with the emotional force of what you are carrying tonight. And the problem that is this large right now will look different then, as it has looked different every morning before this one. The room is quiet. The dark is the same dark it has always been, the same dark that every human who has ever lain awake in it has navigated and then survived. Every single one of them, waking on the other side of it into a morning that was more manageable than the night had advertised. The thought is still there. Of course it is. You do not have to make it go away. You do not have to win an argument with it. You can simply note what it is, an appraisal produced by a tired brain in the dark, running on depleted prefrontal resources, absent the interruptions and the social reality checks and the reappraisal capacity that will all be available again in a few hours. And you can put it on the page if you need to, in plain words, so that the morning version of you can read it back and take the accurate measurement. And then you can let the machinery of the night do its work. Because the science is clear about this too. Sleep is not passive. It is not a waiting room. It is a process. And the process includes something that looks very much like what you need right now. A quiet, gradual, overnight reduction in the emotional charge of the things you are carrying. The biology has been handling this for you, without your instruction, for every night of your life. It will handle it tonight as well. The worry that feels like the true size of the problem is not the true size. The machinery that would know the true size is resting, and it needs to rest. And when it wakes, it will give you a reading you can trust far more than the one the dark is producing now. And the dark will end, as it has always ended, and the morning will arrive with its better instruments and its clearer light and its restored capacity for proportion, and the thought you are holding right now will look different in it. This is not a promise made to comfort you. It is an observation drawn from neuroimaging and chronobiology and decades of clinical research, and from the record of your own mornings. The night version has never been the accurate one. You already know this. You have always known it, in the way that lived experience teaches things the body understands, even when the mind has not yet found the words. The science has simply given you the words. The amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex and the cortisol nadir and the suprachiasmatic nucleus and the REM and the overnight therapy and the dark enhanced startle and the default mode network running in the quiet. These are the words for something you have felt 1,000 times and were never told had a name. It has a name. It has a mechanism. It has a number. And none of it is you. None of it is weakness. All of it is biology, doing what biology does, in the dark, as it has always done, in every human body that has ever navigated a night with a worry in it. You can rest now. If you felt something in this, something that named a thing you have carried for a long time without a name for it, I would genuinely like to know. The comments are there, and I read them. And if you would share where in the world you are listening from tonight, where the dark is as you hear this, that would mean something. The thought of all the different darks this is reaching into, all the different ceilings people are looking at, all the 2 a.m. minds that are, right now, slightly better calibrated than they were an hour ago. The night is doing its work. The morning is coming, as it always comes. The thought will look different in it. You're moored safe in the sleepy harbour now. Drift off.